Well, when we play Witcher or Kingdom Come, the atmosphere feels unique, something new that is distinctly different from the games we are used to. This feeling is the cornerstone of these worlds. For me, as a Slavic person, they aren't just beautifully crafted games, they are digital reflection of Slavic cultures. Now we can pack a lot of meaning behind the word culture, but for this video I want to highlight 4 main pillars: folklore, history, traditions and music. By leaning into these 4 points, games create a unique landscape that appeals for the masses, while proving that every part of the world has something special to offer. They are so well crafted that anyone can appreciate them, even without realizing how deeply important they might be to the people they represent. My neighbors in Poland made a phenomenal game series, The Witcher. Most people have probably played The Witcher 3 or are looking forward to the upcoming 4th game. But what stands out here isn't necessarily just the mechanics, it's the landscape. The Witcher universe is set in a land heavily inspired by the Slavic medieval period, brilliantly bringing Slavic folklore to life. This universe was originally created by Andrzej Sapkowski, but I feel like the visual heavy lifting was truly done by CG Projekt Red. They took ideas from the books and translated them into a visual experience. This is what makes games such a unique medium. I can actually see and participate in a world that is incredibly distinct and represents a massive part of Slavic culture. As a Slav, it is extremely satisfying to explore a distant fantasy land that simultaneously feels so familiar, reflecting my own Slavic roots. The Witcher is of course mainly a Polish game, so a lot of the elements primarily reflect Polish folklore. However, it's wonderful to see, through this medium, just how much Polish and Czech cultures have in common, something clearly visible throughout the game. Sapkowski drew inspiration from a rich mix of Slavic folklore, European fairy tales, and Arthurian legends. That's undeniably a lot to pull from, but he also included strong historical parallels. For instance, if we look at the nations represented, we can see that Redania uses a coat of arms strikingly similar to Poland's. Then we have a Kedven, which historically mirrors the Eastern Slavs, with their focus on cavalry and militaristic expansion. Lastly, in the Northern Realms we have Temeria. This is the main region where most of the games take place, and I have always found it interesting to draw parallels to it as a Slavic French hybrid, especially given its coat of arms and character names. But The Witcher isn't the only unique series we have with special ties to Slavic culture. Warhorse Studios created the Kingdom Come Deliverance, a game that focuses purely on the historical period of the Kingdom of Bohemia. For me, as someone who calls the Czech Republic home and lives just a few kilometers away from Kutná Hora and Troský Castle, it is truly special. It brings me immense joy to see a handcrafted setting where people from all over the world can digitally experience and appreciate the beauty of Czech history. Experiencing the Czech history from the viewpoint of a peasant, a blacksmith's son, is incredible. The idea that you have to actually live in that world and that it can even be frustrating at times really brings us closer to what we imagine life was actually like back then. Of course, it is still a game, but those interactive elements create an incredible immersion. Going to a grindstone to physically sharpen your sword, or brewing potions in a practical, hands-on way, instead of just clicking a menu at the crafting station, makes you feel like you are truly doing the work, added to that the experience of seeing real historical figures who helped shape the direction of medieval period, and it's just amazing. It really goes to show that even a small country can create something incredible and tangible that people everywhere can appreciate. I feel like these 2 games perfectly represent those 4 pillars I brought up earlier: folklore, history, traditions and music. So let's take a step back to The Witcher and look at its folklore. When you venture into a town or a village in The Witcher, you find notices on a board for contracts. These contracts lead you to different creatures that are harming the local folk, and they perfectly represent Slavic folklore. I think one of the most interesting examples is the Polednice, or in English, Noonwraith, which has different interpretations across Slavic cultures. In folklore, the story usually revolves around a young or older woman wearing a white or a red dress who hunts people on hot summer or spring days. She approaches them and demands answers to her questions. If they answer incorrectly or can't answer at all, she kills them. This was traditionally seen as a form of punishment for working during the hottest part of the day, when people should be resting. However, she might also reward some people. For instance, young girls might be challenged to a dance, and if they could keep up with her for a long time, they would receive a good dowry for their wedding or some jewelry. But a Noonwraith can also be the spirit of a young girl who was murdered on her wedding day, or who suffered a terrible fate before she could be married. In The Witcher, there are at least 3 contracts that directly tie into these stories. The quest usually involves a spirit hunting a field or being tied to a specific location because of a grudge it holds against the living world. One of these happens right at the start of the game, with a well in the White Orchard. Then we can find another one in Velen, involving a ghost hunting a field after being murdered, and a similar encounter takes place close to Novigrad. These in-game spirits really share the exact same descriptions I just mentioned from the real folklore. One thing I feel is important to mention is that most of these stories resemble tales of the Grimm brothers. Their fairy tales weren't Disney stories with happy endings, they were dark, moral lectures meant to teach children how to behave. We have this in Czechia too. A lot of Slavic stories aren't happy, they are moral warnings. What comes to mind is Kytice by Jaromír Erben, which contains various stories that share striking similarities with the grim fates you see in The Witcher. It's very different from Hollywood's vision of storytelling, and it's fantastic to see a medium use this to its advantage, creating something truly unique in gaming. Other great examples we could look at are Drowners and Leshy. Drowners can be drawn directly from Slavic myth, as drowned people who were either victims of a foul play or sinners who met a watery end. But they can also be tied to a vodnik. We have these creatures in our fairy tales. They are the rulers of their own lakes, and stalk their prey either to trap their souls in the jars, or if the victim is a woman, to take her as a suppose. Now, Leshy in folklore is a guardian of the forest, to people. He mostly acts devilishly because he's protecting nature, and he views humans as intruders. He targets lumberjacks who wants to destroy the forest, or travelers setting up camps and hunting wildlife. In the old tales, he is seen as an old man with long hair, glowing eyes, and long claws, though he can also shapeshift into the wild animals. If you wander into the woods, his presence is usually signaled by the sounds of fake animal noises or strange echoes bouncing throughout the trees. As I mentioned, these were just a few examples from the bestiary. There is a vast array of creatures inspired by folklore, and you might find others that appeal to you even more than the ones I have chosen. But before moving on, I have to mention one incredibly interesting part of the game that beautifully reflects this entire folklore ecosystem, let's say. The witches in the Velen swamps. The crones really tap into the pagan worship rituals that were customary in eastern parts of Europe. It reflects that grim but fascinating reality of people putting their faith in an entity that gives them hope. Even if the price is brutal and involves sacrificing children. It is a concept that heavily resembles the tales of Baba Yaga. But the true beauty of Slavic folklore is the idea that some creatures are not necessarily evil. They might be a little mischievous, but in the end, they can act as protectors and guardians of the common folk. Very much unlike the witches in the Velen. Many of these spirits are just trying to live alongside humans, even if some people despise them and want them gone. As Geralt, you often get to decide their fate. I really like his general approach. If a creature is intelligent and doesn't intentionally hurt humans, it should be spared. For example, in real folklore there are creatures like the domovoi, who protects houses and a guard kettle. We see parallels to this in The Witcher, with godlings like Johnny or Sarah in Novigrad. They are a little playful, but ultimately kind to the local folk. One creature that I believe is executed brilliantly in The Witcher is the botchling. In Czech, we would call it potracenka. It's a demon born from a stillborn, miscarried, or unbaptized infant that wasn't buried properly. This creature focuses deeply on the cultural and social traumas surrounding childbirth and infant mortality in those times. It also highlights the theme that much like the Nunwraith, many monsters are born directly from human actions and mistakes. Yet, there is a beautiful duality to this. As I mentioned with the domovoi, it shows that Slavic creatures aren't inherently evil. If you decide to perform the naming ritual, which acts as a proper burial rite, you transform the botchling into a labriken, or a klobuk, a protective household spirit. This perfectly captures the beauty of Slavic folklore. Some monsters can be friendly and good towards humans, depending entirely on how they are treated. Now, in real folklore, a klobuk is often depicted as a spirit that steals from a neighbor's, meaning you have to take a very good care of him, otherwise he will turn on you. Still, I feel the game adapts this beautifully, turning it into an incredibly heartwarming resolution during the Bloody Baron storyline. Lastly, I might contradict myself a little bit here, but there is one contract on Skellige that puts Leshy in a more neutral light. Some locals believe the creature actually helps them, making their young men into stronger hunters, if they live alongside it. It might just be a superstition, and personally, the ancient legends in the Witcher universe still seem highly aggressive towards humans, but it adds a fantastic layer of cultural nuance to the world. I touched on this bit at the beginning, but the game features incredibly well written storylines that mirror the real history, which is honestly one of my favorite aspects of the series. Witcher brilliantly and tragically represents the horrors of war. It pulls us in right from the start in White Orchard, where the Demarian lilies have been torn down because the nation is no more. We find stranded orphans and we see people hanged from trees. Some were executed because they turned against the occupiers, while others were falsely accused by their own neighbors just to claim a hefty reward. All of these elements deeply reflect the dark historical periods that our Slavic regions have experienced. Now, I don't want to compare Nilfgaard to modern extreme regime. I feel it acts more like a well-structured parallel to the Holy Roman Empire. Nilfgaard sees the northern realms as barbarians who need to be educated, and as long as they pay their taxes, they are mostly left alone. In one of the game's endings, we clearly see that Temeria can become a vassal state, and largely go about its business, which is a surprisingly positive outcome in the grand scheme of things. These horrors of war are heavily represented in Velan, but we also see their ripple effects in Novigrad. One major thing I want to point out in Novigrad, which strongly parallels the regime of the past, is the witch hunts. We witness the persecution of bright minds simply because they are deemed enemies of the dominant religion. The Church of Eternal Fire has absolute influence throughout the game. Players see what radical movements can do to people and how suffocating that oppression becomes. These movements always need a scapegoat. At first they blame the mages, but after you help the mages escape, the Church immediately turns its wrath onto non-humans. In Witcher this means the dwarves and the elves. I know we see similar themes in the games like Dragon Age Origins, where you can play as a city elf, confined to an urban ghetto, but I feel the Witcher explores this much more deeply. You see books being burned in the streets to eliminate knowledge, a terrifying tactic used throughout the history from medieval inquisitors to 20th century fascists. This oppression is palpable, whether it comes under the guise of religion or ties into the radical politics of King Radovid, who orchestrated witch hunts. That later morphed into purely racial purges. Because the mages escaped, the movement simply found another marginalized group to target. One of the great examples of this radicalization of religious movements is seen in the questline Carnal Sins. It's inspired in a way by Jack the Ripper. Across the city there is a series of brutal ritual murders that focus firstly on poor people and vagabonds, and later move on to the nobles and artists. The authorities don't really seem to take any interest in it, and honestly, Geralt probably wouldn't either, until Priscilla becomes a victim of the series. Luckily, she survives, and Dandelion asks us to find the person responsible for this. Through investigation, we notice that these ritual murders are deeply in line with the fanaticism of the Church of Eternal Fire. Every victim is left with a letter, written on a human skin that tells us about the next target. As we trace the clues, we hurry to save the next victim, a noblewoman named Patricia Wegelbot. But we are too late. During our short visit to her estate, though, we learned something really interesting. Patricia was actually having a massive crisis of faith with the Holy Fire, because of the purchase and the ethical dilemmas surrounding it. Because of this, she had just ordered her servants to burn most of her religious books. I think this is a brilliant detail, because it shows how many followers will completely renounce a faith once it becomes too radical. But tragically, because she turned away from it, she became the killer's next victim. On Patricia's body, we find a note pointing to the next target, Sweet Nettie, who is currently at the crippled Kate's brothel. As Geralt bursts in, he is told that the Sweet Nettie is with a very important person, but he doesn't mind that. As we enter the room and see Nathaniel Pastori, a reverend of the Church of Eternal Fire, ready to torture Sweet Nettie with a hot iron for her sins against the faith. We learn that he did this to previous victims too, after they turned away from the church, but he swears he would never actually kill them. Nathaniel is clearly sick and perverse, fully twisted by the ideology of Eternal Fire, which perfectly shows what a radical faith can do to a man. But he is not the actual killer. If we look deeper, we realize the murderer is no one else than the city coroner, Hubert Reik, who is actually a higher vampire. He dislikes the current state of the city just as much as the Church of Holy Fire does. He sees Novigrad as a fallen city where people have lost all moral standards and decency to one another, and he decides to remind them of this in a horrifying way through ritual murders. He even tries to justify his victims to Geralt, a woodcarver who spent his last copper on sex workers, a countess who defied symbols of faith, and an artist who believed nothing was sacred. He genuinely thinks their deaths could help others as lessons, so they find the right way back to the church. This is truly a brilliant storyline that puts into the perspective what can happen with extreme radicalization. It shows how easily a fanatical ideology can poison both a human institution and a literal monster. And it really mirrors a few moments in real history, especially in Slavic history, where radical movements violently policed society under the guise of morality. I feel this also brilliantly reflects Graal's personal experience. Throughout the game, you are constantly called a mutant and verbally attacked. Having these moments in a video game is incredibly powerful because you experience it firsthand. You aren't just reading about prejudice in a book or watching it happen to a third party, you feel the stink of it yourself. It's clear that whoever wrote these narratives understands this deeply. I believe this resonates so well because Slavic history is unfortunately rooted in experiences with oppression, racism, and being dismissed as a subhuman by invading forces. Lastly, I almost forgot, but it's definitely worth mentioning, is Skellige. This region strongly reflects the Scandinavian countries that historically raided Europe for loot, and that Viking inspiration is heavily reflected in their customs and traditions. It is worth noting, because the game doesn't just look inward, it includes elements from border history that still tie back to Poland, as Vikings historically raided the Baltic coasts, primarily Pomerania. Probably one of the most crucial aspects of any game when it comes to immersion, action, and setting the right vibe is the music, and The Witcher absolutely excels at all of these. You might hear ambient background music that catches a certain vibe. It's vastly unique, but can also feel comfortably familiar. For example, tracks like Whispers of Oxenford share some atmosphere similarities with kind of music you might hear in Dragon Age. But where The Witcher takes a dramatic and brilliant shift is with its use of classic folk music. Through a collaboration with the folk metal band Percival, the game injects raw traditional sounds into fast-paced action tracks. This is arguably most noticeable in the iconic combat musics like Steel for Humans and Silver for Monsters. Or my favorite one, You Are Immortal, that plays when you fight Olgierd von Emmerich. The legendary Lelele, the song Lazare, comes from an Eastern dialect. The original Lazare is actually a traditional Bulgarian folk song, historically performed during rituals that involve singing, dancing, and blessing homes. During horse races, you hear more relaxed folkish tunes like Cloak and Dagger. And when you sit down to play a Gwent, you get this thrilling Eastern European tavern music. It is exactly the kind of lively music you would imagine hearing at a village feast or a wedding. This specific vibe shines incredibly bright in the Heart of Stone DLC when you attend the wedding with Shani. The music there fits perfectly with what we in Czechia would call veselka, a traditional village wedding full of unique folk dresses, lively customs, and celebration. The Witcher captures this authentic rustic village atmosphere absolutely flawlessly. As I mentioned with the Heart of Stones earlier, there is a very nice detail about this whole DLC. It takes both history and folklore and brings them together. Take Olgierd von Everec and his Wild Ones. They are heavily inspired by the Polish nobility. Their clothing is highly traditional, even if the game tweaks it a little bit, he wears a jupan, and no, don't mistake it for a bathrobe. His hairstyle is also something that Polish nobility exactly tended to wear. This adds a great historical element focused entirely on one person. When you look at a king like Radovid or an emperor like Emir, the historical parallels are obvious to most of us. But Olgierd in his own way is more hidden, and most people might not even take notice of his real-world roots. And then there is the legend of Pan Twardowski. The main idea of Olgierd's story is heavily inspired by this. As the legend goes, Twardowski made a deal with the devil to gain magical powers and wealth in exchange for his soul. With the devil's aid, he quickly rose to fame, ended up as a courtier at the king's court, delved into magic and so on. But same as Olgierd, he had a loophole. His soul could only be taken by the devil in the city of Rome, a place he never intended to go. But the devil tricked him into a tavern what was called Rym, which is Rome in Polish. Twardowski then started to pray to the Virgin Mary, which made the devil drop him on the moon. He is still there to this day, using a sidekick he turned into a spider to get news from Earth. In a lot of ways, the legend is very similar to the Hearts of Stone main storyline. It's really nice to see a myth paralleled into a game for us to experience, especially since most people may not even realize it. Now, The Witcher is an absolute giant. It serves as a beautiful ambassador for so many Slavic cultural elements, from folklore to historical parallels and music. But for me, as someone from the Czech Republic, it is incredibly important to talk about Kingdom Come Deliverance. For us, I wouldn't be afraid to say it is a cultural jewel. The game drops you right into a period of absolute chaos in Bohemia. The great monarch Charles IV has died, and his successor, Wenceslav IV, is supposed to take the crown and travel to Rome to be crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But Wenceslav is nothing like his father. He prefers drinking, hunting, and writing over actual statecraft. This leads to a massive dissatisfaction among the nobles, to the point where his own half-brother Sigismund uses the unrest to temporarily seize control of Bohemia, plunging the kingdom into chaos and imprisoning Wenceslav in Vienna. This is your historical backdrop, but here you aren't playing as a chivalrous knight or an overpowered action hero. In the first game, you start out as a literal peasant. You can't read and you can't even swing a sword properly. Instead of letting you slice through Slavic folklore as a heavily mutated witcher, Kingdom Come shoves your face into a harsh reality of the Middle Ages. It practically leaves you in the dirt. You have to learn everything from scratch, and it functions brilliantly as a brutal medieval simulator. Now, Kingdom Come 2, which I believe will be a massive mainstream hit of the series, much like The Witcher 3 was, maintains this grounded feeling. Even though Henry, our main character, is more experienced now, the game never lets you forget where you are. One bad move in combat can still be absolutely fatal, forcing you to respect those harsh medieval conditions. This immersion is heavily supported by the physical actions you have to take in the world. You have to actually go to grindstone and manually sharpen your blade. You have to do proper blacksmithing work to forge a weapon, or brew potions by physically following recipes at the alchemy bench. Doing all of this by hand sets a clear premise. You have to put in the work, and doing so completely immerse you in the world. But honestly, for me the raw gameplay mechanics aren't even the most important part. What I truly love are the historical landmarks. From the silver mines in Gutenberg to Trotsky Castle, it is breathtaking to see them in their full medieval glory. Especially since Trotsky today is just a set of burnt ruins. Seeing these cathedrals, the architecture and the beautiful landscape that I can actually see every single day when I step outside my door is an incredible feeling. Seeing the success of this game means that millions of people get to experience the beauty of my tiny country. It proves that we have something truly special to share and that it's a wonderful feeling. It is amazing to know there are such talented people bringing these historical places to our screens for us to explore and enjoy. And speaking of landmarks, we can even draw a parallel back to The Witcher. For example, Novigrad strongly resembles the real-life Polish harbor city of Gdansk. It's just so satisfying to see our real world, geography and history honored in these massive games. Kingdom Come also integrates folklore beautifully into the game. One of the romanceable characters, Rosa Rudhart, is based on the real-life Czech legend of Rosina. According to the myth, she fell in love with a poor knight. Her ambitious, greedy father was furious because he wanted to marry her off for political power. So to protect his wealth, he bricked her up alive in the cellar of the Rudhart estate. And local superstition says that to this day her ghost still wanders the streets of Gutenberg. I feel this is where Kingdom Come shines. If this were The Witcher, you would be hunting a shurikening wraith in a cellar, but in Kingdom Come, you meet the real living woman behind the myth. Ultimately, one of the most remarkable things about the video games is their ability to craft engaging stories inspired by both the historical and fantastical parts of our cultures. We see this in The Witcher, ranging from folklore like the Nunwraith, a young woman wronged before her wedding who now hunts the fields, or the Labriken who stays behind to protect the household. To heavy historical parallels that reflect the dark real-world past of Slavic nations, enduring occupations, the horrors of war, and radical ideologies. Then we have the direct historical simulation of Kingdom Come, featuring real landmarks and historical figures. It shows the harsh reality of these places, and basically gives players a form of virtual tourism. You get to experience everything firsthand, from the grind of the blacksmithing and alchemy to simply taking in the breathtaking beauty of someone's home country. Sharing this with the world for everyone to experience is incredible. It clearly shows that video games are far more than just a way to cool off or kill time. They deliver beautifully crafted worlds that preserve and reflect vital cultural heritage. And the absolute best part? The native dubbing. You can experience The Witcher in Polish, with English subtitles for maximum immersion, or play Kingdom Come in Czech to form a deeper connection with the culture you are exploring. And who knows, maybe you will even pick up a bit of a new language along the way. Anyway, thank you for your attention, more content to come, though not guaranteeing similar quality.